Okay, so pop culture is just, you know, at its most basic, it's just the popular culture. So whatever is popular at the specific time, in the specific place, where you are. So I want my, okay, maybe I don't want that. I wanted my little like arrow thingy or my laser pointer. But like Air Jordans are a big thing in pop culture. If you have a pair of Air Jordans, you are the bee's knees. Or if you have a specific hairstyle or listen to specific music, you know, you are popular because those things are popular. So popular culture, it's just forms of contemporary culture, so of modern culture, that are made popular by and for people through the mass consumption of these products. So they're made popular because people purchase them, and some things are marketed so that they become popular and they become consumed and they become bought and listened to. So I think our example last class, we were talking about like Nicki Minaj and like her music and stuff. And is she the one who did WAP or whatever? But that song was probably written so that it could become popular. You know, clothes and shoes are designed so that people want to wear them, so they become popular. Music is catchy so that people listen to it. Oh, Cardi B, I guess, is the one who did WAP. I have no idea. Tells you how involved I am in the pop music of today. And then folk culture it's not controlled by any one particular industry. So when you think of the Hollywood movie industry, that's pop culture. If you think of a little like indie movie producer who get together with some of their friends and make a movie, that might be more folk culture. And folk culture tends to not be as driven by a profit motive. So Hollywood exists to make money. The music industry exists to make Justin Bieber and Cardi B and Nicki Minaj money. So when you guys are doing your ethnography, you might talk a little bit about both of these things. Because if you think about folk culture, that could be like some of the traditional dances, some of the traditional arts that they do, traditional stories versus what they have for pop culture now that has maybe become more Americanized or more influenced by the Chinese or Japanese or whatever the dominant culture is in that particular geographical region. So does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okie doke. Well,
Yeah.
one person at least to say. Okay. So there are 4 characteristics of pop culture, and that's what makes it popular or pop culture. So it's produced by culture industry. So things like Hollywood, Bollywood, you know, the American movie industry, the American music industry, the K-pop music industry. I remember when I was in middle school, it wasn't K-pop that was really popular, it was J-pop. I hope that doesn't age me too much. But they're produced by specific industries within a capitalist system. So North Korea does not have a pop culture of their own, right? They do not have a capitalist system that puts out, you know, movies and music for entertainment. They have a governmental system that puts out propaganda. So any pop culture that is in North Korea comes from outside. So it comes from South Korea, it comes from China, it comes from the US. So these industries, so like the movie industry, music industry, view their products, so their movies, their songs, they're products of pop culture, and they are to be sold. Maybe this is why pirating music is a crime punishable by up to a fine of $100,000 or whatever the term is. I don't know. You always see it on DVDs. Pirating movies is a crime. Yeah, because it exists to make profit, not to just be solely for entertainment or to educate, because it makes the industry's money. It is different from folk culture. As we see, this is the difference between folk culture is not pop culture, though aspects of folk culture can come in to pop culture, but they are distinct things. Pop culture, it does exist everywhere, and it fills a social function. So some of the social functions might be that, how many of you guys actually watched Game of Thrones?
I definitely did.
You definitely did. So at least there's Nick in here who watched it. Anyone else? You can just put like a little like thumbs up or whatever, and then I'll see it pop up on your screen. Or anyone who like watches like The Bachelor or Bachelorette.
Okay, yeah, I've watched The Bachelor, but not Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
Same difference.
Okay, never heard that, but okay.
One just has dragons, but other than that, but we can bond over that because those are shared stories we have. I can be like, oh my gosh, Nick, what did you think about that Game of Thrones season finale? Like, what the heck? Why would they do that to us? You know, no spoilers or whatever. Or I could be like, oh my gosh, like, you know, Paige, did you see last week's episode of The Bachelor? Like, why in the world would he, you know, go on a date with her? You know, she's a total, you know, butthead or whatever. Right? But we can bond over those things. They're stories that we can share with each other. And of course, in a society, we need to have bonds in order to build. So we relate to people through those. Or it's like, hey, you also like Nike shoes. I like Nike shoes. Let's be friends, even though it's probably a little more complicated than that. That's the basic gist of it. Come on. Okay, there we go. And then the US in particular is one of the most prolific distributors of pop culture. Pretty much anywhere you go in the world, you can see some remnant of US pop culture. You'll see, you know, ads for US products in Japan. You will hear US songs on the radio in, you know, probably not Bangladesh. I'm trying to think of another country. You know, in Somalia, you will see US fashion sold in, you know, China or India. So we have a very strong grip on the US world culture market, I guess to say. But if we remember back from what we were talking about at the very beginning with globalization, so even culture, and particularly pop culture, has become globalized because we're circulating and buying and selling these cultural commodities or these cultural products. But obviously, pop culture differs in different countries, right? What's popular in the US, music-wise or music video-wise, is probably not as popular in, let's say, Saudi Arabia. You can get a lot of tension, and there has been a lot of tension between like the US and the Middle East, because the US is trying to sell their cultural products, you know, sell their music, sell their clothes, you know, earn money by selling to, you know, markets in the Middle East. But, you know, having a music video with a half-naked woman in it is not going to go down very well in a place where women are required to cover themselves pretty much from head to toe. And that causes tension because they're like, we don't want your culture in here because that's not how we do things. But of course, companies want to make money, so they keep trying to sell it. And then there's this term cultural imperialism, which basically says, you know, as pop culture moves into other places, it can take over. I don't know if you guys know or not, but interesting fact, I believe it's Qatar over in the Middle East. Well, I mean, there's some places all over the world in the Middle East and Africa where the US food market has moved into. So places like McDonald's, Wendy's, KFC, all the American fast food, right? they've moved in and they've started selling that because, you know, McDonald's, it's very much American pop culture. I'm sure most of you guys at some point in your life, or if not once or twice a week, are, you know, sitting in your dorm room or at your house and you're thinking like, man, I just really want a cheeseburger and it's 2 a.m. Where am I going to go? McDonald's. But now those places in the Middle East and Africa, they are struggling with obesity for like the first time in, you know, pretty much the entire history of, you know, their country because of this Americanization of their food systems. And Gary, yeah, if you have time at the end and you want to get it done, we may as well knock it out of the way. But does that make sense so far of what we're talking about? So cultural products moving across the world, particularly from America, because America does put out a lot of cultural products. We put out a lot of movies, we put out a lot of music, you know, and not everyone always appreciates that, particularly in cultures where their values are different.
Are like cartoon strips and things like that, those could be pop culture too, probably, huh?
Yeah, because, you know, humor is a part of culture. So, like I know, like Sunday comics, they're the Sunday funnies are like a really big thing in American newspapers. So, you know, does your culture do something similar or something different? And then what kind of humor does it use? Because I'm trying to think of the ones I know.
Like Family Circus.
Yeah,
probably.
Family Circus, Garfield, stuff like that. You know, not everywhere might find that funny because they might be like, well, why would you treat your parents like that? You're a little turd, or, you know, whatever. Or why is a cat in the house?
Yeah.
Instead of on the dinner table, right? Yeah. But we view other groups of people through the lenses and through the boxes we've been told to put them in. And a lot of that it comes from popular culture. So actually, Gary, this would be a really good question for you because I know you can probably answer this one. And then, I don't know, maybe Suzette could answer this too, probably. I'm trying to think of people who might be at least my age or older. So if you remember all of the James Bond movies, like pre-2005, who were the main bad guys?
Well, there was Goldfinger was one of the bad guys, but they were all big Americans typically. And I don't know if that's where you're leading, but I'm trying to think back.
Okay, so James Bond are like British produced movies most of the time, right? I mean, some of them were produced in Hollywood. But
seemed like they were either Russians or Americans, and mostly Russians though.
Yeah, and if you remember what was going on in, let's say, between 1960 and like 1993, it was the Cold War.
Yes.
And the Russians, you know, were the big bad. And of course, all these spy movies come out where, you know, the Russians are the big bad. And of course, people who are watching these movies, they're getting that put into their head of like, oh, well, all these Russians in these movies are, you know, the bad guy. And that, you know, of course, it doesn't indoctrinate us to say, oh, all the Russians are evil, because we know that's not true. But then we start to view that particular cultural group through the lens of pop culture. And then if we look at like American made movies between, let's say, 1995 and current day, I'm thinking of like war movies, but obviously, quote unquote, the enemy is people in the Middle East. A lot of the big bads are Middle Easterners. Or I still feel like American movies like really pick on like Russians too.
Yeah.
maybe I feel like we never got over like being irked about not being the first people into space.
You know, one of my favorite pop culture stories about American movies is, you know, like in the 70s and 80s, people would come to America for the first time, and before they would come, they would buy cowboy boots and cowboy hats because everyone thought that John Wayne was the stereotypical American because they had all seen those movies.
Yeah, and that's a great example because like, you know, our pop culture does get spread out everywhere. And, you know, back in, 80s or whatever, if the only movie they've seen are John Wayne, then that's probably how they think all Americans dress, is in cowboy boots and spurs and a hat and a bolo tie. But we also have, like, I have a scene from a British movie that I might show. There is some cursing in it, but it's showing how some of the British people might view American tourists, because it's from In Bruges. Or how many of you guys remember like all the high school films or movies that are based in high school, like High School Musical and stuff like that? I'm trying to think of other movies that like take place like where the main characters are in high school. But as people who went
Twilight.
Which one?
Twilight.
Twilight. Okay, great one. So all of us are Pretty Little Liars, yeah. So as people who've gone through high school, right, we can say that it's like, high school wasn't like that. What the heck? We were not out partying every weekend, most of us. It does happen. But we weren't out partying every weekend. We weren't out drinking or like murdering our friends or, you know, insert whatever else here that they try to show us like, oh, this is a typical American high school. No, we went to class, we told some bad jokes, and we did chemistry, and then we went home. Right? At least most of us. So, you know, but if people from other countries are looking at these American high school movies and they're thinking like, man, those American kids are crazy, like they're out drinking and partying and doing drugs and having sex and like releasing cows in the school, they might have a very bad view or a very twisted view of what happens in American high school. Here, like Cobra Kai, the Karate Kid. So how are we representing ourselves as Americans, and how are we representing, you know, other groups, you know, in our pop culture, in our media? So, and that's kind of something to think about when you're looking at this, if you look at this for your ethnography. So, so like if you're doing Samoa, you know, Samoan pop culture, what is it? How do they represent themselves? How do they represent other groups? And then what might that say? And then I think we've already talked a little bit about the implications of U.S. Dominance in worldwide media, because not everyone always likes what the U.S. has to put out. The Middle East tends to not like American music or American movies because there are, you know, too many, you know, there's a little too much sex for them. The Chinese market really loves American movies because we have very simple plot lines and we have a lot of explosions. I don't know if you guys saw or not, but earlier this week I saw a headline that said James Cameron's Avatar, you know, Blue People Avatar, not M. Night Shyamalan's travesty. It was re-released in China and has retaken Avengers Endgame as the #1 top grossing film ever in the world. So, and it was because it was re-released in China, and the Chinese really love American movies. Okay. So like we said, our pop culture dominates the world market. And then can you guys identify any pop culture influences from other parts of the world? Well, one example might be like K-pop is actually really, really big here in the US. I can't tell you why. I honestly have no idea. But it is like, you know, K-pop bands come to the US and they play in sold out stadiums. And it's like, how many Americans actually speak Korean to like understand what they're singing about? Probably a very small percentage, but they still manage to be a huge part of pop culture. What else? Can you guys think of any examples of pop culture influences from elsewhere?
Japanese anime is a really big one.
Yep, Japanese anime. That new episode of Jujutsu Kaisen today. Manny, can you think of any?
I don't know if this is exact influence, but with Netflix and all the other stuff that's out, I've been super influenced by British Baking Challenge.
Yep.
And I think that's a pop culture thing there, but it's not like Chopped per se. It's a different approach, but I don't know that. Now I think I'm going to be a baker.
Yeah, so like the Great British Bake Off, and things like Monty Python, and things like holidays. So even in the US, like Dia de los Muertos is, a pretty decently sized thing that people celebrate. St. Patty's Day, like they don't even really celebrate like over in Ireland, but in America, St. Patty's Day, like we dye the Chicago River like green. Apparently not this year though. But people go out and have huge St. Patty's Day
They did it this
parties.
year.
Huh?
They did it this year. It was last year they didn't do it.
Okay, yeah, someone told me that they weren't doing it this year, and I was like, oh.
Yeah, my brother's out there, and he got some really good pictures of it.
Cool. Yes. But what else? Specific like styles and stuff. So like, how many? If you've ever bought something off like Wish or what's the other one, like Shine or Alibaba, stuff like that. Those are all like clothing companies and stuff based in like Asia, with a lot of Asian fashion. Which
is it like TikTok dances? Because they're like famous everywhere, all around the world.
What was that first part?
TikToks.
Yeah, so TikTok. So I've seen some of those like TikTok challenges and stuff that have, originated in other parts of the world that have, moved to become super popular here in the US. Or like songs that people use for, they're like, oh, this song is in Chinese, but it's really cool. It has a really catchy beat. I'm going to put it in my TikTok.
Would even like the platform itself be considered a pop culture product? Because TikTok came to us from another country and it's taken the American market by storm. But I don't know if it's the content or just the software platforms or usage of social media platforms could be considered a pop culture thing.
I'd say it's both, because if you remember back in like 2010, 2012, 2013, Facebook was like the huge big thing, and then it was Snapchat and Instagram, and now it's TikTok, and those are all parts of pop culture. And for those of us who like don't have a TikTok or whatever, we miss out on some of that pop culture, because I like, for me example, I don't have TikTok. I've never used it, and I saw a YouTube suggested video, and it's like, oh, TikToker somebody, whatever, and had like 10 million views. And I'm like, I don't even know who in the world this person is or why she's popular. Because based on like that 30 seconds of the video, she seems like kind of a butthead. Like, what does she do that made 10 million people like her enough to watch it and make her famous on TikTok? So, but yeah, definitely pop culture, both like the actual social media itself and like the content on it. Or like the ice bucket challenge. I remember that from when I was in school. That was a big thing, and that was part of pop culture because it raised really quick and then dropped right off. So,
And what I never knew about the Ice Bucket Challenge until more recently is that it actually started as like an awareness campaign for, I believe, ALS.
yeah, it was supposed to be like a fundraising thing. I think it was like people were supposed to like, pay to see you get, this ice water dumped on you. And then if you raise enough money, you do it, and to raise money for ALS and stuff. But I think it just turned into a whole bunch of kids being like, we're going to dump water on our friends because it'd be funny. So,
Sounds like, well, what was the incident?
But we've talked a little bit about this already, like this cultural imperialism. So it's that domination through the spread of cultural products. Like I said, America is really, really good at this cultural imperialism thing, because that's what Hollywood does. And I keep using Hollywood as an example, but really, like, it is the best example, because you can find Hollywood movies pretty much in every single country. Like, there probably have been Hollywood movies smuggled on flash drives into North Korea. But Americans are really good about putting out movies. And then you have also electronic domination. So domination or exploitation using technological forms. China's pretty good at this. So like with their stuff like TikTok, other technological forms, and just straight up technology. But yeah, most pop culture in the world is produced right here, US, homeboys right here, and then circulated. But there is that imbalance. Like, Bollywood from India, it puts out just as many movies as Hollywood does at just as good quality. And sometimes they're even more fun because you got like that dancing and music and stuff. But most Americans don't watch movies produced in India, or movies produced in China, or movies produced in Russia. So there's that imbalance between what the US is putting out and what the US is bringing in. And I could talk about this all day because, like, when I was in grad school, I looked a lot about like television and media. But it tells us kind of what to think about, but not what to think, just what to think about. And then, we use pop culture to see what other countries are doing and how they live their quote unquote daily life. But even though we know it's not a true reflection of how their lives look like, but we try to understand the dynamics of what is going on there. And then we can either consume or resist pop culture. So when we're consuming pop culture, we're listening to it, we're watching it, and it helps shape kind of who we are and what we think about ourselves in relation to other people. And I kind of talked about this in regards to the social function. It helps us, build bonds and build bridges between people. So like if both, Paige and I watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, then we can both be like, oh my gosh, did you see Josie last week on The Bachelorette, blah, 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 blah. Or we can both watch Survivor and be like, oh yeah, like I'm so glad that Joe won that challenge, or it's so cool to see all these people like struggling and, making it through and, showing that American spirit and can-do attitude. But it helps us form our identities and helps us think about who we want to be based on what we see in media. So maybe we see someone who we find is like really, really attractive, and we say, oh my gosh, I want to be like her. I want to be, I want to look like her, and I want to dress like her. So I start to change myself in that way. Or, I want to be, strong or emotionally like this particular character in one way. And then if a lot of people identify with that, then we eventually start creating these more evened out identities with more people towards the middle rather than more people on the fringes, if that makes sense. And then, of course, some people resist popular culture. You know, if you don't like certain types of music, you're not going to go listen to it. If you don't like violent TV or violent video games, you're not going to play them or you're not going to watch them. I'm not a huge fan of Cardi B or Nicki Minaj, so I don't seek out their music. Not a fan of country music. Don't seek it out. But we might be resisting that because that is part of pop culture. Like if you're one of the 15 people, you know, in the United States who never watched an episode of Game of Thrones, then you definitely resisted pop culture because maybe you thought it was too violent or too sexualized, or maybe you just didn't like it. So you didn't seek it out, but you resisted pop culture. Or if you're like me, who's never seen an episode of Friends or The Office, that's totally part of American pop culture, but you know, you've resisted following to watching it. Because you might be concerned about, you know, the show stereotyping women or stereotyping men or stereotyping another group, or actually what the media images show. So because maybe it's violent or sexualized or insert whatever else here that you might not want to see. And then, of course, how are we representing our different cultural groups? So how are we representing Americans? How are we representing Russians? How are we representing Asian Americans? So, but if you are an immigrant, then you may have a specific way about thinking about American pop culture because of how you were raised, what media you grew up with, and how media in the US shows your particular group or your ethnic group or your racial group. But it just, different shows represent them in different ways. But the big thing to know is that TV shows do not reflect the reality of living in any particular country. Even if it's a reality TV show, it tends to be scripted, or they still have a narrative they want to follow. So just because Survivor's a reality TV show doesn't mean that they do not have a narrative that they are trying to follow. Or just because The Bachelor is reality TV doesn't mean they haven't already decided that, okay, it's going to be down between these two women before they even start, you know, filming really. And that goes for every place. And then if the only thing we have is popular culture and we don't seek out, you know, ethnic media or media from different cultures or countries, how can that help create or reinforce stereotypes? Well, if you only have one source, which might be Hollywood, then that's the only opinion you're getting, even if there are diverse directors in it. So some things to think about, just the biggest one is really be reflective when you're consuming media in all forms, whether that be Instagram or TikTok, Facebook, Hollywood movies, movies from other countries, or any type of music. Because if someone is trying to sell you something, they're trying to sell you something, whether it be a physical product or an idea. Be aware of how the popular culture you consume might influence your worldview or how you see yourself or how you want to be. Be aware that the media portrays different cultural groups in different ways, and they might be unduly positive or unduly negative, and that might influence your interactions with those particular groups. Think about if you need to resist popular culture, when should you do so and why? And then, if necessary, how can you be an advocate for those people whose voices aren't heard in popular culture? Maybe that's making a little mini movie of your own, showing a particular aspect of a culture that the mainstream media doesn't cover or the mainstream pop culture doesn't. That'd actually be a really cool assignment to do. Have you guys make a little mini movie or video. Okay, so do you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns about that before I turn the time over to Gary? Okay, so just as a quick reminder, we have our pop culture discussion. So find some examples of pop culture, whether it be music or movies from the culture that you are doing your ethnography over, and post them, and then what you think it says about their culture. So let me, and I believe my screen share stopped. Okay, perfect. Let me stop